passed our 50-year milestone with Telos. We had our 50th anniversary issue. Here are complimentary copies for those of you who aren't subscribers, so please feel free to take one. Second commercial, a new book from Telos Press by Alain Benoit on democracy and populism. For those of you who are eager to have criticism of neoliberalism, this is where you get it. Probably there's no one who's more cogent critic of neoliberalism than this, which should give you pause. And of course, there's a compelling introduction by Tim Luke and me.
The books can be purchased directly at telospress.com.
Right, so you can take a look at this. You can't have that, and here are sheets about it if you want to order it that way or order it online. So just a few comments on empire in the wake of the discussions here. I guess 3 points. One is one I've already made, and that is the real crying need for some conceptual clarity about nation versus empire. I think we have an instinctive understanding of what one is and what the other one is, but to the extent that empire is often associated with a notion of malign domination, I wonder about the basis of assuming that nation is also not involved in malign domination. In terms of domination, in terms of that logic of techne that was talked about, I think, in one of the first sessions, nation and empire may be indistinguishable. They're both about rule, they're both about governance, they're about monopoly of violence, et cetera, et cetera. Unless you're going to give some essentialist priority to national community, which is going to involve you in all sorts of other sort of creepy stuff. So I don't think we saw both our vehicles for group. There are other grounds on which to distinguish them. Maybe empires are bigger than nations. Maybe empires have greater diversity than nations. But they're going to both have police forces. They're going to both have armies. And if you're on the wrong side of the law, you're going to end up in jail. You know? The second point has to do with kind of shadow to the question of empire, and that is anti-imperialism. And we haven't talked much about that. I think there's a spectrum. There's a right-wing conservative anti-imperialism, and there's a left-wing anti-imperialism. For people who populate universities, you're much more familiar with the left-wing anti-imperialism. But I would count Arendt, for example, as a conservative critic of imperialism in her book Arms of Totalitarianism. Her concern is that empire erodes the vitality of the limited polity. And I'll associate Arendt here with someone with whom she, I'm sure, has never been associated before, but the argument she makes there is effectively echoed by Patrick Buchanan, a republic, not an empire. Right? So if you want to be anti-imperialist, at least know who else you might be in that boat with you. More common, as I said before, is the left-wing anti-imperialism in the academic world. And I think there one has to think through what values are maintained and what values are jettisoned. Left-wing anti-imperialism often takes the shape of attitudes toward Orientalism and anti-Orientalism at this point. And that anti-imperialism is a vehicle to find solidarity with political forces with whom one probably doesn't share any other traditional progressive value. Give up on gender, give up on et cetera, et cetera. To a certain extent, it comes up in the discussion of North and South. If that's the primary distinction, a kind of anti-imperialist critique from the South of the North, what happens to class? Are we really prepared to say that the Latin American oligarch Sean is ipso facto has ipso facto progressive priority over the unemployed worker from the north of England? So I think something else has to get thought through there. And then third and last comment, I'm interested in the shape of national populism that's emerging in the United States and in parts of Europe and elsewhere. And the one thing you can say about it is that it's not empire. It's about a retraction of the scope of spatial domain. It doesn't mean that there aren't inconsistencies. It doesn't mean that the policies are carried out clearly. But if one thinks about the last 4 American presidents, so since George H.W., we've had one from each party. Clinton and Bush were both part of a liberal world order. Inconsistent, I get that. But Yugoslavia, Iraq, that's an imposition of their will in the name of some norms. Where that stopped was the red line, was Obama's red line. I think you can make a strong argument that he would have had a justification to uphold the norm against the use of chemical weapons, but he chose not to. I'll call that a slide toward a left isolationism, which is now being repeated by Trump in a kind of right isolationism. And both of those are de facto anti-imperialist.
Thank you so much. So going in the order listed, may I please now invite Jay for your initial 5 minutes.
Sure. I've been impressed with the way the papers in this conference have really addressed the theme, the endurance of empire. There's many unexpected ways in which it seems that empires endured, and I think I don't want to spend too much time addressing Wayne's sort of sustained complaint about this conference, but it's worth questioning. I mean, it's a radical complaint, and I think it's seriously intended that we've been using a word that's vaguely defined, semantically ambiguous, et cetera, and so forth, perhaps untranslatable between cultures and languages. But I think semantic vagueness, I'll speak as a philosopher for a second, semantic vagueness isn't the same as meaninglessness, right? And maybe I'll paraphrase Aristotle here. Empire can be said in many ways, right? But perhaps with implicit relation to one central concept that itself cannot be articulated. That's why you have to have a big conference in Sicily to come at it from a lot of different semantic directions. So that would be an alternative semantic theory to. I think it sometimes sounds a lot like you're endorsing some form of recovered logical positivism.
Prager.
But pardon?
Prager.
Yeah. Well, with the strict linguistic meanings that will advance us, will allow us to say something meaningful. Anyway, let me put that aside for a second. We're talking about the future of empire, right? So on the assumption we are speaking meaningfully about something and not nothing. Right? The future of empire, as you know, I guess I canvassed this in my paper. I believe this really is fundamentally a normative question. And that's sort of what attracted me to this conference, is that there's this unexpected way in which you can introduce the notion of empire into normative political theory, right? As something normative political theorists want to think. What do normative political theorists think about? Maybe we don't have a sense of what that is. It has something to do with thinking about what the best sorts of political arrangements are for human beings, the ones that, as Adrian, I think, put it before, contribute to a kind of human flourishing, right? Or as Wayne puts it, maybe bring us into view with new forms of human community, right? Where humans may flourish. So the surprising, I think, suggestion of this conference is the normative suggestion that empire isn't the subject of what Russell began by talking about the stale anti-imperialists, right? The stale anti-imperialist discourse that just automatically discounts empire as not having any forget about salvageable normative meaning. It's demonized, right? It's not something that's even worth the normative theorist's attention. So I think that's it's very interesting, and so we have to ask these radical questions about look towards history, which we've been doing. Ask with Nietzsche, or I thought of Nietzsche's phrase more than once about the use and abuse of history for life. Right? There's a way of looking at history with normative intent, where you do look at something like empire, the history of empires, and it's not just sort of cataloging them and keeping track of them, etc. But you look at them with this view, this normative view, to ask this basic question: is there something for us as political theorists who want to envision something like new political arrangements, new forms of community, and so forth? So that's the big question of the conference, and I just want, I guess, at this point, want to register a how should we put it, a skepticism about empire as a topic for normative political theory. I think there's a certain, in the Telos crowd, a rightful zeal about the critique of particularly economic liberalism. The critique of economic liberalism brings us, I think, to the contemplation of a recovered normative notion of empire as something meaningful for us to think about. And I think we might be prematurely throwing away the prospects, the potentials of what has more than once been talked about, particularly by Adrian, as the artifice of the modern nation state, the Westphalian artifice, something sort of externally imposed in some ways on human beings that isn't in our best interests, that doesn't contribute to human flourishing, and so forth. I think that it's worth another look. Maybe this will be a minority view, but the modern nation state probably, I think, and this is in some ways goes back to Aristotle, although he had no concept of the modern nation state, but certainly of Polis, right, as a discrete political unit that contributes to human happiness, human flourishing, and certainly the cultivation of virtues, human virtue. Empire, right? We usually think of it in terms of scale. Is this a place where people can acquire and cultivate the requisite virtues for a happy and meaningful life? I can't connect the dots. Whereas, as far-fetched as it is, I think the modern nation state, with all its bureaucracy and market-based logics and so forth, might stand a chance.
Thanks so much, Jay.
I guess I'm going to just try and lay out two kind of versions of empire you might imagine. So the one would be trying to think through the nation state not as an opposition to empire, but really something that actually has to exist within a kind of imperial system. So, I mean, if you think about the British, the French empires, I mean, they were essentially sort of nation-state empires, right? So that even if they had an imperial reach, the basic kind of political basis of political sovereignty was the nation-state vision. And we get that now in the same sense, in that if you think of the United States as presiding over that kind of nation-state order, we do have individual nation-states, but obviously they're not equal. And it's clear that the United States kind of presides over that order and kind of is the policeman, is the sort of guarantor of that order and the way in which it should function. So that so you can imagine the nation-state system as really a form of empire, right? So it's really kind of the U.S. empire as one that imagines relationships between peoples as relationships between nation-states, right? So that would be one form of empire. It's essentially the form of empire that we have today. That's sort of the most clearly taking the role of that kind of imperial function of regulating relationships between between peoples, right? The second version would be really, I guess the closest real world example we have is probably, Iran and its attempt to kind of do this sort of Shia Muslim thing and spreading it across the Middle East. And what's key to that is that, just as the US empire has a kind of overarching universal ideology of liberalism, another empire is going to have some kind of universalizing ideology, and if Shia Muslim Islam is a kind of universal ideology, then that's what would be the kind of universal conception that would tie together different peoples and still give them the sense that even if they're existing within their local context, they're part of something greater that's universal, right? Because that's the empire is going to exist based on its power, but also based on a kind of universal ideology. And then the other aspect that I guess the other vision we have is I talked about just a few minutes ago is China, where it seems like it's not clear that they're going to have a universalizing ideology. It seems like at this point they're trying to create something like that, but it still seems to be falling into a kind of Chinese nationalism, but in which they really are depending on conquest as well as a basis. And it'll be a question whether they can figure out some kind of universal notion that would be able to border relationships both within China, and they've got this huge problem with the ethnic minorities, but also with neighboring states in such a way that all those both the minorities and the neighboring states feel like they're participating in a common project and are willing to be sort of subsumed within that greater universal project. And then finally, I guess just to emphasize that there's this. The issue of empire is also an issue of power. It's not just about ideology. So I agree with Jay about this normative aspect, and that's why an empire has to have a universal kind of vision. But without the kind of power that would come today, comes with a certain kind of economic power. It's not going to. It can maybe have a regional significance. For instance, that Iran is developing, but it won't have the type of reach that the U.S.-led imperial order is going to have.
Thank you so much. And Richard, please.
Thank you very much. When I was thinking about this, I thought I would just sum up just a few points of what the discussion said and use that as a kick-off point to look to the future. And I got to 11 points and still counting. But being a hopeless idealist, I thought, well, let's go for it. We'll see whether I can test Andrew's tolerance to the absolute limits here. And obviously, what I'm thinking in terms of its rehabilitation, obviously, of empire as a concept. And also, the focus really is on the future of empire studies, because empire studies came back big time in British education, in particular, about 2 decades ago, with courses and so on, and empire. So it's back, the empire is back, and the study of empire is back. So let me very, very briefly just touch on these 11 ways to go. So the first one, obviously, which we've discussed here. The first one is obviously empires of trade and interconnectedness, which go back into prehistory. We're talking about all sorts of movements, Cornish tin to be found in China and so on, which means that well before the modern age, there were trade links and so on. And whether they were empires or not, I don't know, but it's certainly connections between people. Second, the classical colonial empires, insofar as there is such a talk, and then shifting into the new imperialism of the 1880s and all of that high imperial thing, which still dominates our political imagination of what an empire is. And of course, now Neil Ferguson's rather distasteful attempt to rehabilitate that particular developmental model, in particular as applied to India. And India, of course, if anybody's been to New Delhi and so on, go to the Gandhi Museum, and you see the detail, step by step, of how British Empire de-developed India, de-developed it, destroyed the handloom, and we know that both China and India were, in developmental terms, far in advance of the West and have in per capita, and of course the top positions and so on. So that's the second, the classical colonial empire, extractive subordination and so on. But anyway, that's thing. The third thing is finance capital. Now, finance capitalism, Hobson, Hilferding, Lenin, we've mentioned the weakest link of imperialism and so on, and of course Karl Kautsky, super profits to keep the working class quiet and keep the revolution at bay, and so on. And indeed, the fact that the British Empire or Britain exported far more capital to non-colonial places from the late 19th century into the 20th. For example, above all, Argentina, which was never part of the empire, wasn't allowed to be. I think there was a Monroe Doctrine or something like that. But it was certainly, but still, massive British capital in, for example, Argentina. So you didn't need the space and capital. But of course, this brings to mind, of course, the empire of financial capital today. Every day, the volume of financial trades are by several orders of magnitude, thousands of times bigger than the exchange of goods and services. So the global finance capital, of course, which took us to catastrophe on the verge of in 2008. So finance capitalism still is something enormous. Fourthly, it's as a type of state formation. Peter Judson has just done this excellent new book on the Habsburg Empire, a new history, full-scale rehabilitation of the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire as a form, as we use this term, political community, all sorts of positives. And anybody like me, one of my favorite authors is Joseph Roth, who says, marvelous works, the Itzky March and so on, that in 1914, of course, the Austrian side, the German sides were a bit upset about the death of Franz Ferdinand and so on, but the Hungarian officers cheered. This was in the same barracks, in the same unit, and so on. And of course, little did they know what was going to be coming along, Trianon and the dismemberment of Hungary later. So it was but to say that sort of book, like of Judson on the Habsburg, all the way through, is just a very powerful sense. The flourishing of the peoples. And the way that the empire then managed it with education and health. I didn't know that until looking at this book of social insurance way back in the 1880s. I mean, of course, even before the Prussians, Germans were doing it, well before we did it at the turn of the century, the liberals from 1906 onwards. So that's applies, but also, it also applies to the Russian Empire. Which expanded, we talked about bases and so on a minute ago, but also the fact that many people in Russia today say that empire is the natural form for Russian or Eurasia to manage its affairs. Zhirinovsky, Liberal Democrats, of course, they abolish federalism, go back to gubernias, go back to this, which allows Russia has 146 minimum autochthonous peoples. There's no nation building, the Slavs came late and so on. So in other words, it's pluricultural, and so on. So therefore, was another point, which takes the next point. Fifthly, it's not the nation state; it's a state nation. Al Stepan and others have written about it very powerfully about India, even little Belgium, but even obviously it applies to Russia. So this is the way, and indeed associated with that, of course, the notion of civilization as a better unit of measurement rather than anything else. Civilization, of course, stripped of Samuel Huntington's simplicities. So sixthly, the United States after 9/11, I used to do a course on this, and the bibliography on US as empire after 9/11 and in particular the Iraq invasion was huge. And the bibliography became page after page. Chalmers Johnson had been mentioned earlier, but it's marvelous stuff. So this is but also the debates about hegemony, as Michael Mann argues, is a rule-bound type of dominance. So the endless debates between empire and hegemony. Wilfred Munkle, in his excellent book on empire, came out in 2007 with Polity, talks about empire and just so you know what you're missing. So it's the seventh point would have been the US-led liberal international order is of course a type of a hegemonic formation with imperial dynamics at its heart, so despite what some of its protagonists were saying. Eighthly, Europe as empire. Jan Zielonka wrote a book now nearly a decade ago, Europe as empire. Why? Because of multi-level governance, but all sorts of neo-feudal elements, or neo-medievalism is I think the word used, neo-medievalism. And of course that's where you have this dynamic flourishing, not of the simple rationalization and simplification of the modern nation state, but empire allows little enclaves I think you mentioned honeycomb model, but indeed, I think that's a very powerful way of looking at it. So just to note that the digital, just what I would say about Europe as empire, is they don't do diplomacy. So that's where empires, in a sense, the diplomacy, such that when Reagan talked about the Soviet Union as an empire of evil, that marked a step shift, not just politically, but substantively, theoretically, normatively. And also
Richard, I just asked people to ask you about 10 and 11.
But 9, 10, 11.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, before we take questions from the floor, may I please just invite each panelist, we'll go in the order of presentation, beginning with Russell, to offer a 2-minute response to colleagues, and then we'll go to questions from the floor, please. Russell.
Yeah, just very brief. I've been insisting on the pursuit of kind of conceptual clarification between nation and empire. There are clearly other terms that populate that field: hegemon, trade links, et cetera, et cetera. David talked about the sort of simultaneity of nation and empire, and I think the China example would be one to dig one's teeth into. Is what's going on in Jiangxing a kind of Han nationalism, maybe, settler colonialism? But the Belt Road, that's clearly imperialism, in an almost Leninist sense, an export of capital across Eurasia. I think the contradiction that the Chinese are going to face is that it's going to be very difficult to maintain Belt and Road through Muslim space if they're engaged in brutal suppression of Muslims in their northwest province.
Thank you so much. Jim, please.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by this question, Russell's question, and it's my question too. I mean, how do you systematically distinguish between nation and empire, since they seem to have many of the same kind of behaviors? Certainly the Weberian formulation about the state monopoly on legitimate violence captures both in this kind of essentialist way. But then I think we have to, I think there's I'm optimistic about a prospect for distinguishing them. If you think about what each might actualize into, so to speak. As I mentioned, I hold out some hope that the nation state, the modern nation state, though no one designed it this way explicitly, is historically implicitly modeled on the Aristotelian notion of a polis where there's a distinct place human beings can acquire, particularly the distinctive virtues of citizenship and a sense of belongingness, a sense of we the people, and acquire some modicum of well-being and well-doing, some kind of happiness in that sense. Whereas empire, I do not believe can, however you want to cut it, slice it, dice it, cannot actualize in that country.
Thank you so much, David. Please.
So, if there's a real advantage that authoritarianism has, then it would be, I think, in its ability to transcend the nation state. So, one of the problems with the nation state, or one of the problems with liberal democracy, I think, is that it really requires a kind of homogeneous culture in order to function properly, which implies the nation state. And if we imagine a kind of, if we're looking at China, which was started, and you're trying to imagine a way that it could develop as an empire, essentially, then it could be that it really, could keep its authoritarianism and avoid its nationalism, and sort of replace it with some kind of a, kind of more universalist ideology that would allow for it to be a kind of more older type of empire that includes all sorts of different cultures and different types of mixed sovereignties, as Adam was indicating. But it would have to do that, I think, probably on the basis of a kind of some kind of authoritarian structure that would not be liberal democracy, so that it could allow for a kind of simultaneity of different, sub-sovereignties within its space. That would be heterogeneous. And so I think, one of the advantages of empire traditionally has been that it's able to include heterogeneous social formations because it's not committed to a kind of homogeneous nation.
Thank you. And Richard, and please feel welcome to take a third minute to allude to numbers 10 and 11.
Thesis 11.
Yeah. Just to say that, tackling up a point about anti-imperialism, but also where the US is going today. In the past, I think the US, if you want to call it an empire or hegemonic or the liberal order, it was clear that empires, classical at their best, are concerned that the periphery has a stake in the development and the maintenance of the center. The Soviet Union lost that at a certain point, and then it lost itself. Today, the shift, I think, in the United States is not, from a left to a right isolationism as such, though that's possible, is that it's now the concern about the maintenance of the center. But it is not, whether it's a shift, and I move backwards and forwards in this, whether it was a shift from hegemony to empire, or from empire to hegemony, but that in itself is a sign of our intellectual mind, intellectual confusion. But what is not being disappeared is primacy. So what Trump is doing is a shift from leadership to greatness, if you like, both if you can intellectually give them substance. From leadership, which was multilateral and so on and so forth, now primacy, and the latest national security doctrine and the nuclear one, and everything, all of them list Russia and China as revisionist powers, and the United States has to be powerful enough to keep them in check. Now that is a step change. It's always talked about leadership and doing all of that. Now the velvet glove almost has come off, and something else has emerged out of it. It's not isolationism. It's a more realist exercise of power. And I'm not saying in a simply denunciatory leftist way. But simply saying it seems this is our analytical challenge of domestically and externally the power element for power systems. And just to say, European Union, of course, has always been negligent of the power consequences of its own actions. It blunders to the east, thinks everything can get away with it. Suddenly, when things happen, why? How did that happen? Why is Russia upset that we, or NATO, why we're upset if there's pushing up against his borders? As the liberals even say, Yavlinsky said, if you have a tank, you paint it pink, you stick a flower in its turret and so on, you still have a big tank rumbling up to your front garden.
Thank you so much to all four speakers for a superb conversation. So we now have time for about 35 minutes of discussion. I think, again, we'll follow the tone that Adrian set last time by going 3 or 4 questions from one half, and the other will begin on this half this time. So Bob, Joanne, is there a third question? Paul. So why don't you all give your questions, then we'll have responses, and then similarly on the other side. Bob, please.
Okay, future of empire. I think we've got a little bit away from the future of empire. I like some of the last comments. 2008, the derivatives economy vastly exceeds the world economy. Another 2008 could be imminent. But I think the history of war and so forth is, and mutual assured destruction. Russia could take out our electric grid, and we could take out their electric grid. There's a mutual assured destruction thing in the cyberspace. But the two positive things that could pull the world together beyond the empire is globalization. We are so interdependent economically. We really couldn't, China, US go to war, ridiculous. They got too many defense suppliers and chains in China for the US to go to war against their own supplier. It's ridiculous. The other thing is global warming, of course, a greater enemy. A greater enemy that it's kind of like the Martians invading and everything. We'd all pull together if that happened. Well, here's global warming, and you see a lot of that. The Paris Agreement has 100% agreement, except for this country, except for my country, thanks to Trump. But everybody in the world is in consensus that they will do something about that. Against that, I see one major problem: history. And if you want to be a great leader, certainly in America's history, the great leaders are all war presidents or major war presidents. And that's the tendency, the pull in the other direction. For a leader to become great, they need a great war. And that's a huge temptation in the wrong direction.
Thank you so much, Bob. Joanne,
Are
please.
there useful and productive ways that we can bring in gender issues, gender spectrum issues, again, patriarchy, et cetera? And I'll bring up an example of this in these political theory discourses. And I'll bring an example up that relates to the Catholic Church as empire. Play with me here, just because it's the quickest example of how a gender-related issue, again, child molestation, possibly will be bringing the church down or have some major impact on it. We already lost a pope because who's currently retired because of it, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we do have the possibility of some useful cases being brought in. We were discussing genital mutilation, I'm sorry, a few minutes ago. But are there ways that we can, again, bring the theoretical bases? If you've got some examples from your own teaching, I appreciate it, especially Jay.
Okay, thank you so much. And Paul, please.
Tell me if this is kosher or not. I'd actually like to direct, to follow up on Adam's presentation earlier, quickly. You had, in your concept of sphere sovereignty, I found that fascinating and very helpful, and an excellent counterpoint to the idea of liberal freedom, as which has built ontological roots to it. And whereas I'm just curious whether do you consciously derive that from or link that to the realism of the type that Johannes Althusser develops, and which is something that we can talk about this outside the conference, but that he has a very similar concept. He was not, I think he was a Lutheran, but our colleague Susan Black wrote a paper on something very similar to sphere sovereignty. We can share it later. I'm just about that. I mean, it seems that it also links up with Schiller's concept of I think it's called autonomy. It's kind of like a freedom from within autonomy that's expressing something what it is.
Thank you so much, Paul. If I may, so Adam, if you'd like to respond, I'll leave that till after 4:30, or maybe you can comment. I will put it aside. What I'll do, thank you so much, all the questioners. Jay, let's start with you, since Joanne directed something specifically to you, and then we'll go David, Richard, and Russell. Please.
Okay. I just want to clarify the question. Is the question about the best sort of political context under which gender issues might become thematic?
Often we end these things with universal health, universal well-being, but by universal we mean universal with a male structure cognitively. Are there ways of opening the discussion so that, let's say, we can discuss patriarchy without burdening everything and saying, yeah, this is patriarchal, that's patriarchal. Are there constructive ways, are there ins on this that will enlighten our research? Maybe not. Maybe political theory is going to be dead.
Well, I think a central concept to ethics and political theory, particularly modern forms of it, is the ethical concept of the person, which is a concept that exists at a sufficient level of abstraction that it in principle cuts across race, gender, class. So it's a very powerful ethical and political concept. And of course, in some ways it popped out of the head of male white Enlightenment philosophers onto pages of books that some people read and some people haven't. The question is, in what degree is it truly an operative ethical and political principle in the modern world, immanent within real political structures? And I think it is, actually. And I think that's part of the story of the modern world, is the story of the development of ethically and politically potent concepts of personhood that do, in fact, give a voice to gendered persons of all kinds. Give them a seat at the table.
Thank you so much. David, please, if you'd like.
So I just want to respond to this idea about globalization and how it would prevent, I guess, conflict, I suppose. And so I guess I don't see that. I mean, with the trade war right now, you can see that there's this possibility that a lot of these linkages could be dissolved, in fact. And so, one of the questions going forward is the extent to which, I guess, the U.S. is going to be willing to dissolve a lot of these trade linkages and essentially sort of partially shut China out of the U.S. economy. So those linkages have developed because they've been advantageous for all the parties involved. But so long as there's some kind of political consideration that would trump those considerations, then I guess that those would dissolve.
Thank you, Richard.
Two things on globalization. It's strange that we didn't focus, and we don't nowadays talk much about globalization because it's a concept which emerged precisely after 1989 and the end of the Second World, the Communist world. So the G word became, you wouldn't see it in an index, particularly in the 1980s. Until then, after 1989, you only saw it and it dominated it together with the concept of civil society. So both equally meaningless in many ways. So globalization, a welcome turn away from that because it assumed the classical models, a certain economic and sociological determinism, reductionism, and so on, which theories of Shirokahane and so on, like complex interdependence and so on. But we know that, in a sense, proportionately, before the First World War, trade flows per GDP was higher than it was. It didn't stop the First World War, and it may not stop the next. The second thing is about, now, I want to take an interesting or different angle, which you may not expect. I think that in all of this, in empire, it's the fundamental element is going to be citizenship. Now, for us in the United Kingdom, it's rather sad because I proudly hold my passport today. It's a British passport, but I am in that passport, I am an EU citizen. So our colleagues here in Sicily, we are co-citizens. So this is actually precisely who we are. I mean, it's magnificent with Vincenzo. We are citizens of a single political community. And it's fantastic. It is marvelous. We've achieved it. We've done it. So many of what we talked about the future. But we are stepping away from it. Catastrophic and so on. But its citizenship is therefore very important. The other side, if you're going to use these larger multinational different forms of political community, a substantive sense of dignity of the citizen and so on. But at the same time, subjectivity is the other side of that. Now, and you may not like this, but there's a lot of debates in Russia where they say why I'm not women, say why I'm not a feminist. We're talking about dignity, we're talking about full-scale political participation, no violence, obviously the normal stuff. Yet the debate is, as in many parts of Africa, a shift away from what they would argue is the feminist imperialism, the empire of liberal feminism, the model of femininity to be, or feminism, to be that of a New York, East Coast liberal and so on. And they refuse to do it. They say, no, that is not our way. We wish to see our social relations within the family. I'm not saying you're saying that.
I understand. It's very common.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, but that is the debate. And what they've come up with the idea, interestingly enough, and I think in parts of Asia and so on, and Ghana in particular, is womanism. So from the feminism to womanism. That means, proud, dignity, development, political participation, jobs, professional, and so on, yet not encumbered by that embeddedness in that Western liberal ontology.
Thank you so much. Russell, please.
Yeah. So 2 points to Richard's comment about the national security document. That came out early in the Trump era, and I think it was significantly formulated by Obama era carryovers. I think that the claim that there's a revisionist element in the Russian and the Chinese foreign policy vision is indisputable. You can say that it's justified or not, but each wants to correct something to regain a position that they believe is rightfully theirs. The difference between that moment of the national security document and Trump coming into his stride is that I don't think that Trump feels that it's primarily the American obligation to resist, to oppose that revisionism. And this came out a little bit in that Article 5 debate about NATO when he was faulted for doubting it. He ends up reversing himself on that. But at stake here is imagine a revisionist Russia, one that is even more revisionist than I think it really is. Right? Imagine it trying to occupy the Baltics or move into Poland to reverse 1989. Question. NATO Would the Bundeswehr fight to defend Warsaw? I don't think so. Would the Bundeswehr fight to defend Berlin? I don't think so. So why should the United States put itself? I think that's the Trump nationalist position. Now you might say that's wrong. The United States should be the leader. The United States should expend its bodies and its treasure to defend Europe. That's a possible position to have. But let's not pretend that there's not an inequity in the defense of that order. And I think that's what drives Trump. Why should kids from Kansas have to die if kids from Wiesbaden won't?
So, and your cities to be incinerated possibly as well.
Yeah.
I mean, for Trump, that's important.
On gender, I think that's an important issue in the discussion about empire and in particular anti-imperialism. My sense is that anti-imperialist rhetoric in general prioritizes the empire question and defers all sorts of other issues like gender till after the revolution or after the liberation. Hence the reluctance to talk about patriarchy in the Muslim world for fear of being accused of colonialism or Orientalist attitudes. I think there are books to be written yet about sexual abuse in communist parties, in China in particular, and how that's played out. This is a big blank. And we heard about liberation theology and its formulation in collaboration with the Catholic Church in the 1960s, 1970s. I bet there was abuse taking place then. Did that come into the liberation theology discussion? I bet it didn't.
They were very misogynic.
Yeah, misogynist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allison. Thank you so much to Silvana. 3 or 4 questions from this side of the room, please. Adam, any others at this point? Okay, Adam, please.
I wanted to pick up on this sort of nation versus empire question, including how sort of broadly inclusive an empire can be, or who can be a member of it. And I think there are some quite interesting historical cases where this ambiguity has played out. And I've often thought that in terms of the trajectory of globalization in the 20th century, one interesting counterfactor would be if the major European empires, instead of sort of breaking up, and actually flatten within and become more inclusive as these kind of cross-regional polities with a common citizenship. And you see this rhetorically being invoked by the French at one point, by the Portuguese, that this could actually be a kind of multi-ethnic transcontinental empire. Obviously, the reality fell short of that. And one interesting fact is that even Enoch Powell, who is now seen as being this kind of anti-immigrant spokesman in the late 60s, back in the 1940s, when he was actually hoping to become viceroy of India, he actually was talking about this idea of a kind of common imperial citizenship, which would be along the lines of the empire. And then later on, he goes back to saying, well, look, if the empire's been lost, Britain has somehow maintained its national personality in a way that other empires lost it by expanding. So I think all of those kinds of ambiguities. In the case of China, I mean, you've had this kind of tension historically between a cultural or civilizational understanding of Chineseness and a kind of ethnic Han-centered understanding. And I think even among intellectuals who are closely linked to the Chinese political establishment now, you do find some people like Yan Xiaotong who are actually saying that one of the signs of China having arrived as a major power would be that it could actually attract talent and become more diverse as well. I think that's still a minority voice, but that I think is a question that any future sort of Chinese hegemon would have to ask itself. I mean, I've often asked some of my Chinese students in Nanjing, if the price of China being hegemonic were China becoming multicultural and much less recognizable in that sense, is that a price people would be willing to pay? And you actually get a very interesting range of answers on that. I mean, for some people, being the center of the world is more important. For other people, being distinct is more important. The issue is when these come to clash with each other, which one wins out and what interests them in.
David, or look like please.
I agree with all you said. This is really kind of, I think, recapitulating a lot of the things that we were indicating about this trade-off between nationalism and imperial, pluricultural space.
Other responses to that?
Just to say that this was a big debate, of course, in the late 19th century, turning the empire
Imperial Federation.
Imperial Federation, exactly, with all of that. So, and it's very interesting, Duncan Bell has just written a book about this, with in a sense, a historical study, with a perspective on the possibility of this sort of debate about future forms of political community.
There was a piece I read, I can't give you the author's name and I can't tell you where it was, but the case was interesting. He Caucasian American, I think, married to a Chinese wife, living in China, fully fluent. He can't become Chinese. He might be able to attain legal status, but he won't be recognized as Chinese. The way that in the Western countries, for all of the xenophobia, for all of the difficulties, people can move from other spheres and then have citizenship claims and be recognized by many as having existential statuses.
So this is a huge obstacle to playing that kind of role in the methodology.
But it came very late to Germany. Citizenship changed very,
Very late.
It doesn't apply in Japan now.
And Japan, of course.
Jay, did you want to respond to that? More via something Richard said, which struck me about the living case. If the EU could be considered an empire of sorts, we have an actual case of citizenship in the empire, and in many ways it actually does seem to be potentially successful. In some cases, people do have a robust self-identification with this entity. With the rise of these nationalist movements, this now seems to be threatened, but at least we, in test tube form, so to speak, it does seem like there's a promise.
And I think the EU has been very successful with it. Richard described that you and Sicilians can be part of the same polity. That's great. I think the problem for the EU now on this issue is more in terms of immigration and there's riots in Germany now. The shift in German policy, the establishment of camps, et cetera, et cetera. So can people come in and become European? If you're already here, this kind of imperial, multi-ethnic, Habsburgian kind of situation. But if you're coming in from the Congo, what difficulties do you face?
Thank you. May I next invite 2 or 3 questions from people I haven't had a chance yet in this session? So,
Not
please.
exactly a question. I'd like to pick up on Jay because I don't want to be represented as scientific or positivistic or anything like that. I'm just coming out of contemporary logic and metaphysics as it's taught in strong universities at the moment, which is not how political theory people are talking. It's got nothing to do with anything like that. It's contemporary logic and metaphysics, so that's where I'm coming from. It doesn't imply a kind of endless argument about language and words and names. It's very much what you just said in your panel. All I'm saying is study actual examples very closely and don't use words without unclear definition to interpret them. So if you want to build a better community, why not look at Austro-Hungary? I agree entirely with Richard. But to do that, you mustn't use the word empire, because once you lose that word empire, you're going to be persuaded in your head that it was an empire. You're not going to be able to do the Hungarian thing properly. You won't be able to do each of the ethnicities properly. You won't be able to understand its enormous creativity, because you'll have the conceptuality without the research. What I'm saying is not word nervousness, but the research has to be primary and empirical, and you use concepts that result from your research, not concepts that replace your research. And that's the great danger about thinking you know that something's an empire before you look. Now, as an Austro-Hungarian, I'm happy to explain that in the next 6 months, that Middle Europa is my world. I love Middle Europa. I hate all nation states for that reason. So you're right on my money. It is a model for a future community, but you have to look at how it actually worked and what really happened. Not look just to the self-babble and self-worship of the imperial regime.
That's great. A clarification. You're effectively saying study the thing or things and not words.
Yes.
This is, as I'm sure you know, words and things have been conflated in the history of philosophy to the point where the study of words and language is substituted for the study of things. And you probably know this too, that the famous ta'an legatai Holocaust being is said in many ways is almost universally translated as the term being is used in many senses. Right?
And the translation is wrong. But we
exactly. But Aristotle says study the thing being or things, and not.
He has no notion of being. It's a grotesque mistranslation.
Yeah, exactly.
Other responses to me?
To say study the thing itself is that the way that this notion of romanticized vision of empire and so on in the UK, sorry to go on about it, but just to say that, then it doesn't just have methodological issues. It's huge political valence, the way the reification of concepts. So the fact that Europe itself became devalued, and the idea of an Anglosphere, rebuilding it back to those debates of the 19th century, it's extremely powerful hold on the political imagination of a whole class, of a whole nation even, but evenly divided. So when you said it was embryonic and so on, after all of this, and now as we head over the precipice, it's becoming much more intense, the debates, the polarization. Those who actually say it isn't just embryonic, it's substantive, it's there. This European Union vision, this idea of moving to this, with all of its flaws involved, we all know about that, but it was a powerful idea, and suddenly, when we are now just about to lose it, it's suddenly become half the population. I think the statistics show it's half, no, but still, the other half now more deeply entrenched, saying, how can we cannot leave it? I mean, we cannot. So we're talking about positive potentially civil violence, potentially conflict now, because of this. Because it isn't just an abstraction, this European Union idea, for all of its faults, it exists, we're part of it, and it's, in a sense, a magnificent experiment. An experiment, in fact, existence, trade flows of our students. I mean, we have students in France, and we have a joint here. We just absolutely go backwards and forwards to Lille, Institut de Politique Lille, several students. And besides, we established in civil society, as we would call it, education society, a single community where it didn't matter if you're French or German or Italian or British or what have you. It's part of the EU. And now suddenly, that's going to be torn apart.
But you also said that there's a split in the population, it's 50-50 or whatever, something like this. And I think you see it something analogous to that in the American polity. And speakers on the left and the right and the center have mentioned the possibility of civil conflict. I think that's the nature of the historical moment.
My reaction is very different, because when I react similarly when I hear the word empire, and I hear the British Empire said alongside the French Empire, because I think they were very different things. I think any schoolboy from the British Commonwealth, I still saw these books on the bookshelf. The Crown Colony is not a protectorate, it's not a protectorate is not a dominion, and India was none of those things. The British Empire was a complex thing. Now, when you come to talk about reconciling national citizenship with a sense of imperial belonging, the concept of dominion within the British Empire is precisely that. You were a citizen of a nation state. You were similarly a citizen of a state within a nation state. In Australia's case, you were a citizen of New South Wales and Victoria. You were also a member of a local government area, a shire, but at the same time you were part of an imperial community. And you had rights within that community that were transferable. You could go and reside in Britain, you could go and reside in New Zealand or South Africa or whatever. And so I think that the problem you pick up, David, is right. That there are trade-offs to be had if you adopt an imperial model where you have some kind of supranational authority that attributes to itself some of the political prerogatives of the nation. As against the nation-state model where you attribute them all to the nation and people are allowed to realise to the fullest their political nature as human beings. But there are and have historically been models that seek to reconcile this. The European Union is one of them. But I would also submit that the British Empire, at least in as far as the Dominion state, the Dominions were concerned, even without doing an imperial federation, managed to do this in a very imaginative way. It was through a kind of a spiritual, almost a cultural bond. This idea of a monarch, a crown that is kind of a metaphysical idea. And it relied ultimately on a willingness, on consent that various parties were willing to give to the idea, but it was still a very powerful idea. And I don't think that you can say that simply because it no longer exists, it didn't have a powerful hold on people's emotions or loyalties, or didn't powerfully structure people's lives. My great-grandmother lived in Australia for 70 years without ever becoming an Australian citizen because she had a passport. It wasn't considered to be a foreign identity. That is one thing. If you talk about the British Empire, talk about it very specifically. And the other thing is, fine, talk about the EU as a good example of this, but acknowledge that there was a previously existing British version of it, that Britain's decision to enter the EU, it collapsed. And there is still the sense of the loss of that, I think, in the rest of the Anglosphere, which I don't think is very widely appreciated in Britain.
Responses to that?
I mean, I agree completely with what you just said. And it's precisely that vision of what's very powerful. And of course, it has not existed in the past. The Queen is still your...
That's right, but it's effectively in a kind of a dead letter sense. Because when I go to the UK, I'm treated as less than a gentleman, or less than a humane, or less than...
You are, since that.
Yeah.
And of course, in Canada, the Queen is still head of state in over a dozen countries and so on. But as you say, the political imagination generated by that is still very powerful. And that was one of the things which we forget, which fed into the Brexit debate. This was a genuine community, and it was powerful.
And it was very on the civil society level, churches and trade unions, and it wasn't just the status.
When I was young, on the map at school, I'm in the pink. We talked about the pink before, but Australia. And in a sense, I knew more about Australia and New Zealand, and the Murray River irrigation project and sheep farming in Australia, and indeed the point at which, then more than France or Germany. So it wasn't as good as us, Australia Shire. It was just another county next door. So very powerful image, and that has deeply penetrated the British political imagination. And it's not. You're absolutely right. But can it be recreated? Can this Anglosphere be now re-established? Of course, I don't think the Australians are waiting for us to come back. So we're going to be out from the EU. Anglosphere of that model is just simply, clearly it's emotion and so on. It's absolutely, I'm agree with you completely.
So, as you said, constitutionally it still exists.
And constitutionally, yes.
So I guess, on the one hand, I agree that sort of the idea of the monarch was really important for them. And that might be a key reason why the French Empire couldn't do that, because they didn't have that same kind of representational sovereign, right? The other hand, though, there is you hadn't mentioned India, right?
Sure.
And there's an issue with India because I don't think that they have that same type of equal status.
Well, I'm not saying it was ideal.
Okay.
But I'm saying that the thing is, you analyze at a particular, if you limit your analysis to a particular level, it's a dominion level.
Well, but I think it's the issue of the extent to which the British Empire was truly multicultural, because if you're only limiting yourself to Australia and New Zealand, essentially, settler colonial populations, right?
No, I'm making a differentiation rather than treating it as one thing. I'm saying that it was a very different creature, and that you need to make a different analysis, a different.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. But with the caveat that there's still an issue there of multiculturalism that was not resolved.
Further questions or comments, please? Just before Joanne's second one, can I just, a very quick question, if I could just interject. I was making Russell's comparison of Germany and the United States and whether one, as compared to the other, should have the obligation or would give itself the obligation of stepping in the instance of the Baltics. And made me think, I have not heard anybody say the word exceptionalism yet this week yet. And is that a relevant factor in considering that scenario and what it says about the endurance of empire thing?
I'm not sure about exceptionalism, how it's pertinent to this question. If somebody else has an angle on that. But I think the issue is trying to gauge the shift in political visions that are taking place now in this era of national populism that seems to be challenging at least the vision of the liberal world order, and then what difficult challenges many of us here will face with unexpected political bedfellows on a range of questions. Again, I won't speak for all of you, but I think there's widespread dissatisfaction with neoliberalism. If you want a critic of neoliberalism, go to the White House. And you're probably not happy with that, but he's the one who's disrupting that model of unlimited, unfettered global trade. That was neoliberalism. And I can't figure this out any better than the rest of you, but I just wanted urging us to grapple with the real complexities of the moment rather than with the kind of mythology of, well, here are the bad guys and here are the good guys.
Thank you. Joanne, please.
Just
please, and then we'll make sure to get Tim's question as well. So if you
No,
can just
I was, mine came through.
Okay, no worries. Joanne,
okay,
please.
just on the title of the session on empires, the mind, and effect. The fictional turn that we've had, the ability for us to accept that many statistics are being, let's say, doctored, manipulated, gained, whatever. Many of the metrics that we're counting on, however we do it, the census. There's some gating going on, whether or not that box is there, whether or not one's a citizen, etc. That will affect those results. And we can go into a number of different areas and talk about how our viewpoint, our vision of what's going on is being doctored. Even Google. Google's not omniscient. All of these organizations need to feed from this resource base that governments often construct. Again, governments have some impact here. And I'm just wondering how much longer this fictional turn. I resonate with Wayne incredibly. We as scholars should avoid that. You know, I teach data visualization, how to line, beginning on Thursday, how to line with statistics, how to present one's information in the ways that we would like. However, how much can we tolerate in terms of the fictionalization of the information we get, whether or not we think the voting totals are doctored, et cetera. Pick your fictionalization, perhaps even some climate variables.
Thank you so much. If I may, I think one of the features of the populist moment is a suspicion of experts. And you can contribute that to demagoguery, but I think you also have to attribute it to a much greater, much more widespread access to information. It's illusory, but there's a sense, at least through the internet, that you can look up anything, you can find it all out. And then if you start looking at any statistical claim, the more it has policy relevance, the more it's going to be subject to political pressure. So there is the issue of the census. There's the politicization of intelligence. There's how do they even calculate the Gini coefficient in the United States. All of this is up for grabs. Once upon a time, this was not visible to the public, and now it's become visible. Therefore, we talk about fictionalization, but in a sense, every fact is subject to manipulation.
Tim, super quick, we have 1 minute left, please.
Well, I was just wondering on that point if that's not also liberalism coming back to bite itself, that we've raised people to think, liberate yourself from all oppressive structures, and the last one left is the government itself.
Yes, and I think it's the contradiction that is written across the page of what is enlightenment. Talk is a question, debate endlessly. Kant could say, well, but you have to obey the law, and now people don't do that.
It's time to head out for another memorable tour. May I please just offer the following? So in addition to our panelists, it's been an extraordinarily rewarding weekend. I'm trying to think of which adjectives to use. Intellectually, culinarily, touristically, at least. And may I please propose that a show of gratitude is due, first of all, in addition to colleagues up here, to the friends and colleagues who made this weekend possible. I think if I'm not leaving anybody out, that would be Mary, Adrian, Violet, and Vincenzo. So please.